Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Comics and Graphic Novels on the Refugee Crisis. I'm Mark. I'm from the Liberal Arts 55 Plus program. Biz Nijdam is going to be giving the lecture. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a minute. First of all, I just want to do a couple of kind of housekeeping announcements. Firstly, and this is important, we're recording this lecture. So if you do not want to show up on our recording, it's probably a good idea to switch off your camera. Otherwise, you will become famous for being the face on our recording. You can leave your camera on if you want, but please note that we are recording everything. The second thing is that to ask questions in this lecture, if you have a look down at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a little chat icon. You can type questions in there anytime during the lecture, just as they occur to you before you forget them. Type anything in. At the end of our formal presentation, Biz will read through those questions and she'll answer them in turn. So you don't need to wait or you don't need to call out, but just type questions in as they occur to you. We are being recorded at the moment, just another mention, and I will now hand over to Biz. I'm just hoping she's here. There she is. Biz, take it away.
Yes, I am here. Okay, first of all, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're virtually gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people in Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm finding that these kind of online events and the lack of physical presence in our virtual meetings makes the importance of place even more palpable. So I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the historic and contemporary caretakers of the land on which we are working, learning, and teaching. I'd also like to thank Simon Fraser University's Continuing Studies for inviting me to speak today and express my appreciation to everyone in attendance for showing up virtually to listen to me present my research on comics about refugee experience. I know I'm competing for a lot of airtime, so I appreciate you joining me here today. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Nijdam, though I go by Biz in all spheres of my professional and private life, and I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia. Though I only recently returned after almost 20 years to step into a visiting position at UBC in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies. I completed my PhD at the University of Michigan in 2017, after which I spent a year in Berlin on a postdoctoral fellowship and a year teaching at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. I'm also on the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Forum and on the executive board on the Comic Studies Society. My research explores the content, aesthetics, and political engagement of comics, graphic novels, digital games, and new media. This work, as you will see shortly, uses visual and literary analysis accompanied by historical context in comics, games, and media studies theories to investigate how media texts intervene in the political discourse around German unification, which is my current book project under contract with Ohio State University Press. Participate in networks of transnational feminist activism, which is my next book project under contract with Routledge, and represent refugee experience, which is what I'm presenting to you all today. But before I dig into this material, I'll be giving you a bit of an introduction to comic studies and its important terms to help clarify the interventions my research observes in comics on refugee experience. My intention today is to demonstrate how comics engagement with serious themes, such as forced migration, represent these experiences differently through the unique capabilities of the comics medium, presenting alternative narratives of refugee experience than those we encounter in other arenas of migrant representation, such as in news reporting. They can thereby counter problematic conventions in the media representation of forced migration, the images of which can often do more harm than good in public discourses on refugee experience. So I'm going to share my slides, but first I'm also going to pop a PDF version of my slides into the chat so that anybody with visual impairment or just if they want to can follow along via PDF instead of Zoom. So they're uploading currently. Ooh, there's a lot of megabytes there, but they will be there shortly. So turning to sharing my screen. Okay, unless anyone indicates otherwise, I'm going to assume that we can all see what I'm doing now. Okay, so let's begin by defining some of the terminology I'll be using today so that we're all on the same proverbial page. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the difference between comics and graphic novels, the difference mainly being in terms of genre and the kind of subject matter examined. Often in academia, scholars try to elevate comics by referring to them as graphic novels, when in reality, comics is the medium or the modality, namely the format that implies certain conventions and representational strategies, while the term graphic novel is merely a genre of the comics form. For example, when we're talking about comics in general, we're referring to the characteristics of this medium, the fact that comics use panels. The comics form uses panels with borders or frames to demarcate the space in which the visual and textual representation occurs, and speech balloons to signal verbal speech, thought balloons for internal dialogue, and captions for narrative exegesis. There's a big debate actually about whether or not we should be using speech balloons or speech bubbles in comic studies, and I obviously hail from the balloons camp of this discourse. Then there's layout to consider, namely how panels are placed upon the page and what meaning is potentially generated by the juxtaposition of text and image. The most important characteristic of comics, however, is probably the gutter. Now, the gutter is that line that divides panels so that individual moments represented on the page are separated from one another. While the gutter is marked by the physical space of the comics page, the importance of the dividing line constituted by the panel frame or panel wall extends far beyond the simple demarcation. More precisely, the gutter signals the liminal space or the intellectual space in which the reader stitches the comic story together. Comics are basically moments of time spread out across the space of a page, and it is by way of the gutter that the reader makes meaning out of the comic's layout. The reader moves between comics panels, making connections on narrative, textual, and visual levels in order to understand the overarching story that's being presented. So considering the function of the gutter in the meaning making of the comics narrative, saying that the gutter is a narrative device essential in comics cannot be overstated. And a lot of the work we do in comic studies is to think about the subjective reading experience of comics by way of the gutter, because every reader constructs meaning differently. Individual eyes track differently across the comics page. Every reader understands connections between images differently based on their own lived experience, and every individual reader brings their own subjective interpretation to bear on the graphic narrative. This is why canonical comics theorist Scott McCloud refers to the comics reader as, in fact, the comic artist's partner in crime. And here is Scott McCloud's example to make this metaphor palpable. We never see the axe murderer dole out his deadly blow, but we see it in our mind's eye as we move from that first panel to the second by way of the gutter. This process called closure, as you can see here in this slide, this is the culminating moment in McCloud's theorization of this idea of the role of the gutter. Moreover, I read the gutter, and as I shall demonstrate today, the panel border in particular, as playful and inventive spaces in which the author or artist can take advantage of the intellectual work required to stitch the narrative together, to make interesting interventions in the content of the comic or the graphic novel. So now that we have some of this language in our theoretical toolkit, I'd like to turn to talking about comics on refugee issues more generally to help scaffold the particular work my research does at the intersection of comic studies and migration studies. While comics on migration and refugee experience have begun to receive a lot of attention in recent years, this phenomenon is not new. For example, even Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman, the comic book franchise most associated with the form, began with the flight from Krypton. However, over the last decade and a half, there has been renewed interest in representing migrant experience, namely that of refugees and asylum seekers in comics and graphic novels. While significant attention has been paid to comics recounting the migration of Vietnamese nationals during and after the Vietnam War, there is an important genre of comics and graphic novels that represents a much more contemporary flight from war-torn regions of the world. Since 2011 in particular, and the start of the civil war in Syria, comics and graphic novels have become an essential forum for the representation of issues pertaining to global forced migration. These so-called refugee comics range from newspaper comic strips and web comics and graphic novels to pro-refugee infographics and, unfortunately, anti-refugee propaganda. Yet, as Candida Rifkin notes, this category of comics is typically drawn by Western cartoonists based on testimonies by migrants and refugees or their work with them. They are therefore typically, and also not unproblematically, not by refugees themselves, but about refugees. However, while the questions of the power relations embedded in the production of these texts remain, comics on global forced migration are still an important avenue for the representation of migrant hardships and refugee experience. Written from the subjective perspective of refugees, artists, and volunteers working in the community, these stories foster empathy and compassion for the plight of migrants internationally by giving voice to countless nameless and often faceless refugees and asylum seekers whose images circulate widely in the news media. Offering a new avenue to thematize issues facing refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced people, these comics promote awareness of the Syrian emergency and the forced migration of many others living in conflict zones in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, with a number of these projects emerging in collaboration with human rights organizations. Generally speaking, comics on migration offer new perspectives on the experience of millions of forcibly displaced people currently on the move. For example, they shift the typical focus of media campaigns on migrant experience to tell stories about the complex issues facing migrants from a single person's perspective, rendering the typical objects of media representation the subjects of their own narrative. Then through breakdown, which is the artist's process of turning a story into an image sequence, and closure, the reader's participation in meaning making of the narrative by way of the gutter, comics weave the past, the present, and the socio-political context together into a cohesive narrative. They thereby render migration experiences legible through the comic's form's ability to present complex narratives and nuance through the visual, verbal modes of representation and their juxtaposition, fostering empathy and compassion for the lives of potentially millions of refugees via the story of one individual or group of migrants. Furthermore, cartooning itself offers an appealing compromise in its ability to represent individuals anonymously, making it easier for subjects to give testimony fully and candidly, while affording these individuals the specificity required to demonstrate their humanity. There can be consequences for refugees who give testimony on their living circumstances and the oppression and violence they encounter. Moreover, evidence of unlawful residence in migrant encampments or an individual's undocumented habitation in refugee camps on their journey to seek asylum, such as that offered by photography, could in fact jeopardize that very process. It is therefore crucial that the forms giving voice to the hardships of refugee life also do not lead to more persecution. Then, set in dialogue with other media representations of refugee experience, comics and graphic novels on these subjects offer commentary on the limits of photojournalism. Refugee and migrant comics interrupt static images with what Candida Rifkin identifies as, quote, the plentitude, fragmentation, and unruliness of the comic's page, end quote, and through what Hilary Shute articulates as a proliferation of frames. At the same time, however, cartooning subjective representation of these personalities also helps readers identify with their stories. Illustration therefore provides a compromise for individuals wishing to document their experience but cannot risk being identified, while the form itself provides these displaced people with an audience for their stories. Comics and cartooning in general enable people who might otherwise be silenced by circumstance to instead have their voices amplified to a wider audience. Comics on global forced migration therefore render the material accessible to younger readers, as well as individuals who don't typically follow the news media. Furthermore, in terms of social justice aesthetics, The visual cues of ethnicity, gender, class, religion, and ability are not easily flattened into single issue subjects, making comics fundamentally intersectional, while the history of the form itself asks readers to question assumptions, stereotypes, and the impact of specific narrative strategies on social justice issues. Moreover, comic artists working on refugee themes are inventing new strategies to communicate these individuals' perilous journeys from war-torn regions of the world, illuminating issues on the presentation of refugee experience in news reporting through the formal characteristics of the comics medium. In addition to engaging discourses of photojournalism and human rights activism through the incorporation of photographic imagery and by virtue of the subjects and geographies thematized, these texts also mobilize panel borders as sites of meaning making, engaging elements of refugee experience at the panel's edge, as well as the digital technologies most important to the process of migration itself, namely the smartphone and social media. The rest of this presentation therefore examines some of the unique ways comics and graphic novels on forced migration are mobilizing the characteristics of the comics medium, namely panel walls, to innovate representations of refugee experience. Here, I'm particularly interested in how refugee comics engage discourses in border studies and migration studies. More precisely, however, I'm interested in how comics about border crossing mobilize the formal characteristic of the comics panel border to communicate elements of that experience. Looking at three particularly inventive examples of comics engaging panel borders in their meaning making, Don Brown's The Unwanted, Stories of the Syrian Refugees, Kate Evans' Threads from the Refugee Crisis, and Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream, the story of Samia Yusuf Omar. The remainder of this presentation will evaluate the importance of thinking about panel borders in representations of forced migration. When we think about borders, generally physical lines or boundaries between regions and nations come to mind. And according to its entry in the Oxford English Dictionary, this definition is essential to its meaning. Quote, the boundary line which separates one country from another, the frontier line. As such, borders demarcate the beginning of one territory and the end of another, often with political and economic implications. They exist as tangible lines on maps and in the geopolitical sphere. Yet, while borders feel physical in their division of people and space, they are in fact imagined demarcations of political power made literal through government enforcement. As such, borders are just as often arbitrary in their construction as they are ineffective in separating the people and places they seek to divide. So while we think of borders as material structures that physically separate populations, cultures, and nations, the areas surrounding borders, the border zones, are in fact spaces of flux, flow, and hybridity. Rather than regions of palpable division, they are spaces of interaction and mixing, which produce new and sometimes radical forms of expression at the intersection of people and social practices. International border zones, and specifically the US-Mexico border region, are widely acknowledged as sites of cultural hybridity. In fact, as Howard Campbell observes, instead of essentializing the ethnic and national groups on either side of political borders, research on the US-Mexico border, quote, has emphasized the ways in which linguistic and cultural blending has created unique syntheses of identities that are binary rather than monolingual or monocultural, end quote. My research engages these discourses in border studies on the productive cultural site of the border zone to understand a very different kind of border, the panel border of the comics medium, and with particular interest in contemporary graphic novels about refugee experience in particular, while still maintaining a relationship to the idea of political borders as an essential element of this new global genre of contemporary comics and graphic novels. I also use the idea of borders and border zones as inventive and hybrid cultural spaces to understand panel borders as equally productive sites of meaning making. Connecting physical borders with physical borders between nations with conceptual borders between panels, where both function as boundaries as well as spaces of intersection. This work examines how panel borders add commentary on refugee experience. I argue that cartoonists mobilize a specific formal characteristic of the comics medium to contend with issues of migration, exile, and displacement difficult to otherwise represent. These artists thereby produce modes of expression that complicate popular understandings of refugee experience in the liminal space between panels. My engagement with border studies theory thus reimagines panel borders as spaces not where the represented moments in time end, though they do that work as well, but as sites in which cartoonists continue their work as witnesses to the refugee crisis and thematize elements of that experience difficult to portray with the written word or conventional representational strategies. Elevating aesthetic strategies to the role of narrative expression, comics artists writing on the refugee crisis mobilize panel borders to add a layer of storytelling that vacillates between the creator's ability to represent a specific experience, emotion, or event, and the very inability to portray some forms of violence, trauma, displacement, and lived experience at all. Now, looking specifically at the role of panel borders in these three comics, I shall draw on concrete examples of how panel borders intervene in comics on forced migration to impart other aspects of refugee experience. Don Brown's The Unwanted depicts moments of hardship and hope in the lives of the refugees he met in 3 Greek refugee camps. Beginning in March 2011, the graphic narrative is told in the present tense, largely through captions that run along the bottom of the panels. The story recounts the horrors, impossible choices, and occasional triumphs faced by fleeing refugees from the perspective of an unnamed narrator, whose commentary reads distant and neutral, but informed. The extensive bibliography at the end of the text further supports the journalistic tone of Brown's graphic novel. Individuals are identified not by name, but by their status as a refugee, by their role in the family they accompany, or simply by their gender and age. This functions to foreground their status as individuals, as well as the universality of their refugee experience simultaneously. The panel frames in Brown's graphic narrative feature both the consistency of mechanized reproduction, as well as traces of the artist's hand. Drawn in thin black ink, the panel frames appear to be individually created for each separate panel. However, upon closer inspection, the lines, with their minor flaws at their intersection and overlap, repeat themselves in multiple configurations of panel layout. This renders the hand-drawn impression of the panel frame itself an aesthetic choice, as opposed to a consequence of artistic practice. This tension between hand-drawn and mechanically reproduced frame, presumably through digital means, underscores the narrative portrayal of individual yet universal stories. Furthermore, the panel borders also feature a commentary on violence. As the only element of the graphic narrative to break through the pseudo-hermetically sealed space of the panel frame, the violence encountered by the refugees of Brown's graphic novel literally breaks through the borders he so artfully constructs. Bullets fracture the panel edges, bombs explode out of the picture planes, and toxic smoke rises through the panel frames. These violent penetrations send fragments of the panel borders themselves, as if shrapnel, into the space beyond the panel's image. Brown thereby mobilizes this formal characteristic of the comics medium to demonstrate the relationship between violence and border transgression with regard to the Syrian conflict. Not only did violence in Syria force many of its citizens to begin their journeys across borders in search of safety and freedom, the violence itself was never fully contained within the borders of its nation of origin, with Syrian refugees enduring brutality and loss even outside of Syria. Echoing border studies discourses, Brown demonstrates how some structures transcend borders, cultural, social practices, and most poignantly, violence, making a statement about the consequences of civil war penetrating national borders and continuing beyond the region in which it began. Then, in this context, Kate Evans' threads in Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream also stand out as important examples of how comics on forced migration experiment with panel borders. However, instead of thematizing the violence experienced by migrants and refugees, these two graphic novels draw attention to other issues at their panel borders, namely the essential nature of mobile devices, both on the migrant journey and in discourses of refugee experience. Evan's Threads is a key text in the genre of refugee comics. And actually, it's one that I'm currently teaching at UBC, so some of my students might be in the audience today. It recounts the author's experience volunteering in the Calais jungle, the largest, though unofficial, refugee encampment in France, which operated during the peak of the refugee crisis from January 2015 to October 2016. Kleist's An Olympic Dream, on the other hand, is one of the earliest examples of graphic narrative on refugee experience, recounting the tragic story of Somali Olympic runner Samia Yusuf Omar and her premature death by drowning en route to Italy. While neither Evan's documentation of life in a refugee camp nor Kleist's exploration of migration through the story of one individual is unique in their subjective interest, the representations of these narratives distinguish them from other refugee comics through their engagement with smartphone technologies. Here, cell phones as objects make their appearance with predictable repetition as a consequence of these comics' subjective interest, which is something I'm going to go into in a moment, the scholarship behind the importance of cell phones and cell phone technologies in refugee experience and refugee life and the migrant journey in particular. And so here's some images from Threads. These two I find particularly fascinating. And then here are a few images from An Olympic Dream. However, these artists also embed the aesthetics of the smartphone and social media into their comics, rendering them essential in the narrative exegesis. By incorporating the aesthetics of mobile devices into the very fabric of their comic art, in which mobile devices and social media visually, literally, and contextually frame content in both Evan's Threads and Kleist's An Olympic Dream, these artists render smartphones and their associated social media platforms panels themselves. Moreover, framing migrant representation through smartphone screens and Facebook posts joins recent trends in the incorporation of the technology of migration into the presentation of that experience to intervene in discourses of refugee representation. And I won't be going into this today, but in a forthcoming article in Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society, I look at the panel borders and threads and the aesthetics of craftivism through the leitmotif of lace that the author embeds into her representation of refugee experience. Like if you see on the right, the top right-hand panel, you can see that like with Don Brown's The Unwanted, Threads also uses lace to signal violence in certain ways. So this is a really complex layering of the use of lace that I find fascinating. And I would be happy to talk about it in the question and answer period. But to return to smartphones. Well, the integration of smartphone devices into comics on forced migration might read as a consequence of the contemporary nature of these comics. The appearance of smartphones in comic art is not as common as you might think. Web comics are often created to be read on smartphones, but they do not typically incorporate the aesthetics of these devices into their representations, unless, of course, they're criticizing their proliferation and impact on our daily lives. However, through the thematization of smartphones and the incorporation of the aesthetics of new media at the very foundation of these cartoonist visual language, these two refugee comics highlight the role smartphone technology plays during the migration journey and in post-migration life. It's been well documented that smartphones and social media provide lifelines for refugees on their journey to Europe. 84% of the population in the Middle East and North Africa make use of smartphones, and 84% of Syrian refugee households in Lebanon, for example, rely on WhatsApp to communicate with friends, family, and volunteers. The portability of smartphones in particular set these devices apart from previous communication tools and has resulted in a new kind of migration experience premised on perpetual connectivity. While many of us experience this kind of constant communication in our daily lives, for refugees, it takes on new dimensions. Access to information via social media can make the difference between life and death for not only individuals and families, but entire boats full of people. With refugees often arriving on European soil with only a smartphone, anxious to find a place to recharge it, these mobile devices have become foundational in shaping the movement of migrants, helping them navigate unfamiliar territory through wayfinding apps and creating a kind of digital passage to Europe. For refugees seeking to reach safe harbor, the digital infrastructure of social media, news and refugee-oriented apps, and Google Maps is just as important as the physical infrastructure of roads, railways, sea crossings, and the borders controlling the free movement of people. Despite displacement, mobile devices thus provide an essential tool for ongoing connection across vast geographic regions. Users send messages, voice recordings, and video recordings around the globe in seconds, informing their loved ones of their current location and well-being, while also receiving the important support, hope, and encouragement that they require to continue their difficult journeys. Moreover, smartphones and social media are crucial in crowdsourcing information en route. Migrants share maps, contacts, and advice in both public and private forums. Facebook in particular is used to gather information in both public and private groups. With access to reliable news and trusted information a perpetual struggle, migrants often turn to news shared by respected friends and families through social media for information. Younger generations specifically consider information relayed through social media trustworthier than news distributed through traditional media outlets. And when mobile phones are lost or damaged, Facebook accounts enable a permanent, if intermittent, perpetual presence. However, while refugees often connect to Facebook to communicate with family and friends, they also use it as a forum to communicate with influential figures in their social media networks, from prominent and respected activists and NGOs to investigative journalists, political commentators, public figures, and participants in controversial debates. Social media therefore offers important platforms for migrant and refugee political engagement through a variety of text-based, audio, audiovisual, synchronous, and asynchronous modalities, mediated through Facebook posts, Twitter hashtags, and WhatsApp encrypted chats. Through digital spaces, migrants and refugees have the potential to generate media discourse and convey migrant issues, ranging from the European contemporary refugee crisis or the integration of refugees around the globe to borders themselves and the politics of asylum. Turning to Evans and Kleist's graphic novels demonstrates how refugee comics engagement with smartphone technologies draws attention to these important discourses circulating at the intersection of new media and forced migration, illustrating how mobile devices offer opportunities for the portrayal of migrant agency, self-representation, political engagement, and connection. In Threads, the function of smartphones is twofold, drawing attention to the ambivalent nature of contemporary connectivity as a source for revealing migrant agency, as well as for disseminating hate speech. Evan first introduces her smartphone at the conclusion of the opening chapter, using it to frame the kind of anti-migrant rhetoric she receives personally on her cell phone. This initial example, which features a text message sent in response to our art, also exemplifies the kind of hate speech that circulates in internet forums and comment sections to news articles. Here, like in other examples of Evan's handheld device functions as an explicit frame to the comic's textual content. The author's phone is positioned oversized yet photorealistic upon a spread of lace, which is an important leitmotif featured in the graphic novel's narrative and formal characteristics. Scrapbook-esque clippings of typed text frame the content of the smartphone screen. Quote, "Phone bleeps into life, connectivity, commentary, follow the threads of the conversation wherever they go," end quote. In this first example, the smartphone is positioned as a technology of connections, one that fosters discourse. However, the hate speech that appears on the screen is wholly antithetical to the kind of connective social function that the smartphone supposedly represents. This incorporating of the mobile device establishes a dichotomy that plays out across the graphic novel, in which the signification of the smartphone pendulums back and forth between connection and alienation. Moreover, this first smartphone splash page serves to establish the mobile device as a formal characteristic of Evan's graphic art, a kind of panel frame of its own, which mirrors its role in several of the 19 chapters of Evan's graphic novel. Also embedded in the stories themselves, the smartphone functions as panel frame in dialogue with the full page attention to Evan's cell phone commentary, changing its position in the graphic design of the pages to come, in which Evan's and other mobile devices are used to reveal various kinds of media content. Yet this example's commentary does little to ascribe meaning to the role of the smartphone in the lives of the migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers living in the Calais jungle. In contrast to the function of Evan's own mobile device in isolation, migrant cell phones serve to connect them with their community in unexpected ways within the chapters themselves. In chapter 6, for example, Evan introduces smartphone imagery in the context of the lives of the migrants living in the Calais jungle. Named after the main character of the story, Hoshar, this chapter recounts the author's visit to Hoshar's 8-foot shack. After making his guests lunch, the four sit down to play the let's show each other our families on our cell phone game. And that's a quote. Evans takes the first turn displaying photos of her family and 2 cats in the UK before Hoshar offers up his cell phone to his company, presenting them with images of his mother, father, sister, and her children Here, the last panel, which takes up the bottom third of the page, offers a subjective camera perspective as we gaze down at Hoshar's smartphone from his point of view to examine a picture of his family home. This panel series and others featuring the quote-unquote game reveal the important role of mobile devices in archiving and documenting migrant lives. They function as vessels of memories of the homes they lost and entire photo albums of the people, places, and things that they value but had to leave behind. This object and its role in migrant lives therefore underscores the loss felt by displaced people upon leaving their home countries to seek refuge in sometimes equally hostile refugee encampments in the EU territories. Furthermore, that this is a game played by both volunteers and inhabitants of the Calais jungle emphasize the humanity of this impulse to archive and share our lives, though in very different contexts. Through these images, Evans is able to find ways to connect to the people she seeks to help, while also making space for them to share their stories by the images they have collected in their country of origin, through digital communication with their loved ones, and en route to their new country, their new home. Even when verbal communication fails to articulate the hardships and loss of life undergoing the process of forced migration, these photographs transcend language barriers, providing a transnational and translingual form of connection that bridges people as much as it crosses borders. And this is another example in a different media format of kind of the same impulse. It's an exhibition, a digital exhibition by Alex John Beck, who traveled to Lebanon in 2016 to take pictures of Syrian refugees and exhibit them alongside their most treasured smartphone photos, which was released the following year. And I think this is a fascinating exhibition practice and looking and afforded mostly by the internet in these kinds of digital exhibitions, which is kind of doing the same thing, elevating the position of the migrant smartphone as an archive of life. Turning to my second example, Kleist's An Olympic Dream demonstrates another kind of incorporation of the smartphone, this time focusing on its preeminent social media technology, Facebook. Here, Kleist employs Facebook as a framework to offer narrative exposition through posts that punctuate Samia's story, supplementing the images and dialogue within the comics panels themselves with additional information. Kleist's text thereby draws attention to another digital space in which migrants are archiving, documenting their lives and engaging in political discourse in social media through status updates and Facebook forums. Samia's Facebook posts both frame the narrative and provide contextual information to the reader. They offer details about Samia's life before she became an Olympic athlete, including references to Somalian politics and the context for the Somalian Civil War. It is in her Facebook posts, for example, that the reader learns that Samia's father was condemned to death because the family does not adhere to Sharia law. Then, upon returning home to Mogadishu after the Beijing Olympics, Samia recounts via Facebook the challenges she faces in attempting to train for the London Olympics in Coney Stadium, and how her insufficient diet further complicated her participation. While at first she perseveres in her struggles to train in Somalia, the political situation halts her training when she begins to receive death threats. So she decides to travel to try to join the Somalian Olympic team, only to discover that they don't have the facilities to train women. Through the lens of social media, Samia voices her struggles, making her thoughts on her personal life and the political conflict legible. But these Facebook posts also teach the reader something important about the role of digital media in the lives of migrants, literally framing them as sites of migrant narrative agency and political engagement. Samia's first Facebook post introduces the aesthetics of the digital medium into Kleist's graphic narrative. Positioned in the uppermost center of the comics page with the Facebook logo featured prominently alongside familiar icons of social media, including the selected audience and the button to post, Samia contemplates her loss at the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing. She thinks back to her defeat with optimism, stating, "Next time I'll do better." Through the conventions of social media, Samia both speaks to her readership, but she also anticipates their reciprocation, concluding her post with, "I'm really curious to hear what you all have to say when we see each other again," end quote. This post sets up the visual language of social media as essential to Kleist's graphic narrative diegesis, informing the reader's interpretation of subsequent Facebook posts, which appear at regular intervals throughout the story. These posts, at times positioned alongside as if panels themselves, and at times hovering within a box that sets itself apart from the comic's grid through layout, or cropped as if comic panels are encroaching on the overlapping digital space, quickly become a crucial element of Samia's story, or more precisely, how she tells her story. Very quickly into the narrative, however, the aesthetics of Samia's Facebook posts shift. While recounting her father's death, Samia's social media engagement exits the confines of the Facebook post box to spread narrative exposition across several pages. Here, the Facebook post begins to take on a new form that continues to appear throughout the rest of the graphic novel, that of the panel caption. This transition from Facebook post to panel caption initially goes unnoticed, as the captions to follow the initial Facebook post appear as just a continuation of the first, and therefore an implied part of the initial social media content. However, as the graphic narrative progresses, the rhetoric of the Facebook post appears both inside social media boxes, as well as in the captions running underneath and alongside Kleist's comic panels. This move is important since the conventions of the comic's caption are so canonized that the act of collapsing this essential formal feature with the aesthetics of the Facebook posts makes an important statement about the agency of the protagonist. Typically, comics captions are words encapsulated in a box separated from the rest of the panel or page. This box, which generally runs along the bottom of a panel frame, usually gives voice to a narrator. However, by making these captions also de facto Facebook posts, the aesthetic of the comic's caption undergoes an important change. The omniscient narrator typical of comics captions is immediately rendered Samia herself. Even if this is only an aesthetic move, Kleist is no longer narrating the story, Samia is. The first-person rhetoric of social media enters into the captions by way of this collapse, making Samia herself the authorial voice of her own story. Considering that Refugee comics, with the intention to spread awareness for the plight of refugees and humanize these individuals, are typically written by people who are themselves not migrants, but volunteers or artists working in migrant communities. These stories are also generally framed by the artists behind the graphic novels, and that's the case with Threads. The story about refugee experience is also predominantly a story about Evans. However, with Kleist's reconceptualization of the comic's caption, the typical object of Refugee comics becomes a narrating subject. This is still problematized by the fact that Kleist is the narrator, but it's an interesting gesture that I find fascinating. Moreover, this strategy of representation resonates with a growing area of scholarship that examines how digital communication technologies and social media have provided platforms for refugees to strengthen their function as political actors, both within their countries of resettlement and transnationally. Alongside growing recognition of refugees as conscious political actors, the political nature of their flight, social media affords new transformative possibilities and extended reach at unprecedented speeds for forced migrants, as well as powerful state actors. So, just to wrap things up, with the focal point of border studies discourse turning to individuals, practices, and culture, the field has already begun the important work of placing human interaction at the fore of its inquiry. Comics, graphic novels on similar subjects do much of the same. By visualizing bodies, graphic narratives on the refugee crisis put the human back into human rights issues, fostering empathy, compassion, and understanding for this vulnerable population. And the plethora of human rights organizations supporting the work of comics and cartoonists is a testimony to this very fact. However, comics open up new opportunities for the representation of refugee experience that move beyond the simple rendering of bodies. Looking at the role of panel borders, for example, in these stories of national borders is simply one avenue for research on the affordances of the medium in its thematization of refugee experience. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen momentarily, and then I'll be able to see all your faces again. And I will look to the chat for questions. Okay. And you're also welcome to raise your hand if you want to participate, if you want to speak with me, for example. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions here that are starting at the beginning of my presentation, so I'm going to take them one at a time. This is from Rob, does it make a difference that V for Vendetta was made more famous as it was serialized and reprinted as a graphic novel, although it actually debuted as a serialized story in the anthology comic? So this is this tension between graphic novels being published when they began as floppies, as comic books, correct? And so this is really interesting because once again, the graphic novel status really elevates the popularity of these books. Also being able to see them in the collection itself, like seeing, not having to work with the serialization of that narrative, because that's a distribution method that is only really familiar to individuals who are really invested in comics. So I think publishing series as graphic novels does make them more accessible. It also puts them in a different place in the bookstore, right? Like, so it shifts the audience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not still just comics when we think about the modality or the formal characteristics. Please speak a bit. So I'm sorry, I didn't see your chat I didn't see this in the chat while I was reading, but I'm happy to provide the transcript of my talk for you to review. I can pop that into the chat afterwards. There is a black screen. Yes, occasionally. I'm an art historian by training, and I know how distracting images can be. So sometimes I just make you listen to me by taking away all opportunities to look at images, which is a different experience on Zoom. So I think I'm going to have to shift that practice. How about showing what you're talking about? Exactly. I hope the latter part of my presentation accomplished that. The target audience for these works, I think that's a really fascinating question because of the way that the target audience is so varied. I mean, these aren't comics that are written for an adolescent audience, that's for sure. But comics being used to teach these topics in high school, I think is an avenue that I find very fascinating. The role these comics play in spreading awareness, not just in terms of individual readers, but being utilized in the classroom environment, which is what I do as well. Requesting the recording to be sent out later. I'm glad. I'm reading some comments that are appreciating my helpful lecture. I'm glad that many of you enjoyed it. And now we are talking synchronously. I've caught up with the former chat. Okay. Somebody is pointing me towards what is perhaps the first refugee comic. I will save the chat and I will look into that. So thank you for that. I always appreciate the things that I learn from giving these talks, because you might not know or guess that I was never a comics fan as a child. And so I'm a comic scholar that is often talking to audience with a much broader understanding of comics because of their history of reading them. But at the same time, I also find that my perspective as not having been a lifelong comics fan makes me see comics differently. So I feel empowered to declare, I never read comics as a kid. I actually discovered them as an undergrad, reading The Watchmen and V for Vendetta. And then as a Germanist, where I teach German language, I saw how many opportunities it offered for language education. And then I just became fascinated with the medium in general, wrote my dissertation on a feminist graphic artist, and have never turned back. Actually, though, now I'm working a lot on video games. So that's my new avenue of interest. Do you have an example of using these graphic novels with refugees themselves? So this is a really fascinating issue, and there's a lot of problems when talking about refugee comics. I mentioned the hierarchies of power embedded in them by the authors that are presenting them. And so comics about refugees are not directed at refugee communities, but there are comics workshops being done within refugee encampments that are to foster refugees and migrants' ability to talk about their own experience. So there's other comics that are talking about the experience of hosting workshops, comics workshops in these specific places. So the body of comics that I've kind of been looking at today is directed at individuals that don't have a good familiarity with the issues of the quote unquote refugee crisis, and creating awareness for the plight of millions of migrants and refugees. Transcripts as well. I'd be happy to share those transcripts. I would like to transit too. I will pop them in the chat. Please don't distribute widely, and please ignore my typos when you do stumble upon them. They're always there. Susan comments, refugee children in schools are encouraged to make art as they are learning English. Visual art is another language that allows them to begin to share their experiences with other children. This can be therapeutic. Do you think writing, creating comics and graphic novels can help reduce trauma in all refugees? This might also help the public understand the refugees' experience. This is a fantastic opportunity to talk about another project that I'm with that is actually doing this very thing. That at UBC, there's a SSHRC-funded project that is seeking to bring together refugees in Vancouver and social scientists and comics artists to help document these experiences. So as a community outreach project, and this is not the only example of that, that's just the example of it that I am currently participating with through the Center for Migration Studies at the University of British Columbia. But yes, I agree. I think that using comics to address trauma and work through some of these issues, there is a really wonderful, it's so difficult to use some of this language when talking about refugee issues, is a really productive way at going at these particular problems when individuals have arrived in their new nation, trying to work through some of the experiences that they've had. And using comics to deal with trauma is important in other areas of trauma. For example, there's been workshops that use comics and writing with comics as a way to deal with the trauma of returning from war. So I know of a few examples of projects that work with veterans to articulate their experience through a combination of text and image, because pictures just really go at this information very differently than words do. And for that very reason, the entire genre of graphic medicine, which is comics and graphic novels that deal with chronic health issues, chronic illness, or mental health issues, is such a powerful avenue at getting at some of these conversations or discussions, or some of this experience is really hard to articulate and approach. So for those individuals that are interested in learning about the way in which comics can represent lived experience that otherwise goes unarticulated, I would advise you to look into the genre of graphic medicine. If you just Google it, there's a whole website and a lot of projects surrounding that. I also teach graphic medicine. Okay, movement towards comics made by refugees, opposed to comics made by refugees. So once again, yes, there is. I mean, it's still in these workshops. There's also comic artists that are going into these encampments. The work that they're doing there is having refugees join them in the production of art, and they're not always making comics. Sometimes it is just art, any kind of sort of visual art practice. But then those comics are not accessible in the same way that these publications are. If you look at Ali Fitzgerald's Drawn to Berlin, for example, that text, she's an American cartoonist who's working as doing work with migrants, refugees in an encampment in Berlin. And so you see some of the work that she's doing in which she's encouraging and fostering the production of art within these communities. Thanks for a terrific lecture. Wonderful. Graphic novel more popular. Do you think the English graphic novel is more popular than the French one? Are there any comparisons on the subject of refugees and genocide? This is a really good question. I haven't delved into bande dessinée on refugee experience, and I know that they're bande dessinée, which is the genre of comics that comes out of the Franco-Belgium tradition, and it's a different approach to comics. The aesthetics are different, the narrative strategies are slightly different. It's like thinking about comics versus Japanese manga and the Franco-Belgian bande dessinée. There are points of intersection, but these are different areas of cultural production. I do know that there is a lot of bande dessinée that does graphic journalist themes, but I haven't looked into bande dessinée on refugee topics, and that's a really great question, so I appreciate that. I don't, even though I'm Canadian, I don't speak French. Fortunately, there's a lot of this work that's translated into English, but that doesn't stop me from looking at the pictures. Great. Fellowship for the International. Ooh, thank you. I will look into the fellowship at the International Jugendbibliothek in Munich. I didn't know. Not a word about Joe Sacco. That's true, yes. So I didn't approach this via comics journalism, which is the genre. So the question here is not a word about Joe Sacco so far, the preeminent war correspondent in drawing. He puts himself inside the stories, which brings up interesting journalistic questions that he addresses in his book Journalism, A Story on Africans arriving in Malta, where he approaches it from all angles, including those of the locals. Yes, Joe Sacco is an important precedent for all of the work that I'm talking about here. And his 1993 publication of Palestine started it wasn't the first example of nonfiction engagement with in the comics medium, but it began this movement that carries on today called comics journalism or graphic journalism or comics reportage, which it certainly has a space in this conversation. I was looking more at the formal characteristics of the panel border, but I think in the video lecture that I just posted for my students, we do talk about comics journalism because Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream does frame itself as a kind of comics journalism. And I find it's fascinating to talk about the ethics of journalism as they emerge in comics journalism. So thank you for noting the absence of Joe Sacco. And I would encourage everyone to look into Sacco's work. Rob comments, I think the French bande dessinée are much more accepted by the population as a whole. France is the first country I've seen advertising for what we would term a comic band on, for example, a bus shelter. Yes, in the Franco-Belgium tradition, bande dessinée is just part of culture, not just popular culture. When we think about comics in the North American setting and in other places outside of the bande dessinée in the Western world, there's a hierarchy there, and comics doesn't have the same position as other cultural forms. But bande dessinée has this longer tradition and is a more a widely accepted form of cultural production. So that's right, Rob. Are you familiar with the graphic novel about an immigrant from Iran? Persepolis, I think, an immigrant from Iran via France. She is also an artist and a video maker. She left during the revolution in Iran. This was done at least 10 to 15 years ago. Yes, that's that title is Persepolis, and by Marjan Satrapi. a fantastic look at oppressive politics from an autobiographical comics perspective. I like all of the suggestions for good reading that are coming through the chat. I really appreciate that. Is there somewhere we could find out more about this outreach project? The one through UBC, I'm assuming, is the one that's being referenced to. I would be happy to put some details into an email, perhaps, that continuing studies might be able to distribute, since everybody on this particular Zoom meeting your email details are logged somewhere. I don't have access to them, but somebody does. So I'd be happy to share some of this information after the fact. Here we go. We got everybody joining in saying Persepolis, which is nice. I'm glad to see so many comics fans in the audience. That's fantastic. The best we can do. Yes, that was one of the Vietnamese comics that I referenced at the beginning, and then I got a lot of thank yous and a lot more thank yous. There are workshops for Indigenous peoples. I attended one by Ram, and I've forgotten his last name is Twitter. Yes, there is another genre of comics that has been emerging in the last decade that represents Indigenous issues in a way that I find absolutely fascinating, because the combination of like text and image alongside a medium that privileges oral communication, I think there's a lot of affordances in the comics medium for discussing Indigenous experience. And I've done some work on Indigenous digital games, though there was a fantastic volume on scholarship on Indigenous comics that recently came out. And there's three collected volumes on Indigenous comics called Moonshoot, Volume 1, 2, and 3, that they're anthologies of Indigenous comics if anyone's interested in exploring the content there. I have so many messages to go. I love how active everyone is being, though it is sad for me that I hear none of your voices. Have I checked the work? The University of Turku. Oh, I'm so glad that somebody referenced this. So hi, Biz from Teo. Have you checked the work by the Comics and Migration Project organized by the University of Turku in Finland, is as best as I can pronounce it. It was a 2-year project collecting info and doing grassroots workshops. They should have a publication with essays on the topic on the way to be published this year. Yes, in fact, I've worked extensively with Finnish colleagues on a variety of projects. Also a project with some overlap with this particular project in Turku. Sorry if I'm doing that really poorly. The project I just referenced was on the representation of women in the Baltic region via comics. And I was supposed to present at the conference for comics and migration that was sadly canceled due to COVID. So there's some really great scholarship coming out of Finland right now on comics in general, and particularly on this topic. Thank you so much for lots of information. Join your present. Oh, I have reached the end of my chat thread. So I think, and I slowly see participants filtering out, so that might be our indication. But I wanted to thank everybody for their avid participation. This was fantastic. I hope I get to talk with you in an audience one day where I can see hands raised. That would be lovely. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass it over to Mark so he can add the concluding remarks. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much, Biz. And everybody, please feel free to virtually applaud in your own living rooms, make a noise. Thank you, Biz. That was wonderful. Very enlightening. I have a couple of announcements. One is that we have the Liberal Arts 55+ program has a lecture coming up on a similar theme on March 13th, Saturday, March 13th at 11:30. Here and There, The Pilgrim's Progress with Nazanin Hozar, an Iranian novelist. This is part of our immigration and citizenship lecture series, and it talks about where do we belong among polarized, fragmented civil cultures all over the world. Where do we belong? Details of that are on the SFU Liberal Arts 55+ program website. Also, I'm really pleased to say that in our summer term, the 55+ program summer term, Biz will be teaching a course for us on a different topic, new media and digital authorship from tweeting to TikToks. So for those of you like me who have dipped a toe into the world of writing online on these various fora that we have, but don't know too much about it all, it's aimed at you. So new media and digital authorship, from tweeting to TikToks. It's not up on our website yet. Our summer term isn't up on the website yet, but keep an eye on our website and you will see that. Thank you everyone for joining us. Overwhelming numbers. It was great to see so many people interested in the topic, and thank you for all the questions and chat. That was wonderful. This lecture is being recorded, and again, look to the website and we will, once we've worked out how to, once I've worked out how to, we will post it. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye now.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.